what I'm going to try and do in this session is the pattern is going to be kind of like a psalm of lament. I say that it's only a little bit tongue-in-cheek. So we're going to start with some disillusionment and some lament and maybe a little bit of sorrow. Maybe that won't be your experience, but it was very much kind of my experience getting into the publishing world and kind of seeing what the reality was. And then we will end with the fairy tale ending. We'll take a turn, like many of the Psalms of Lament do, where we come back to hope and a fresh perspective and faith in God, knowing that there's an ultimate redemption to all of this, even though it's not the world we wished we live in. So that's what we're going to try and do, and try and leave as much time as possible for Q&A, because a lot of people have very specific questions. But so, help, I've written a book. I have a lot of conversations that seem to begin that way. Whenever I give a talk on writing and publishing, or if I'm somewhere and someone says, "Oh, you're an author," I also write, and I'm close to the end of my project, or I finished a project, and what do I do next? What are the next steps? Come in. If you would like a handout, I have handouts. Take one. You are welcome. So we'll begin with the lament, and we'll talk about the state of publishing. And I want to talk about kind of the two big factors driving industry change. The first one, actually, that's a bit of a misnomer. The first one's not much of a change. So first one is unpredictable readers. This is probably the biggest force in publishing, is the unpredictability of the market. So I have this quote from Dale Carnegie at the top of the page. During the first 35 years of the 20th century, the publishing houses of America printed more than 250,000 different books. Many were financial failures. The president of one of the largest publishing houses in the world confessed to me that his company, after 75 years of publishing, still lost money on 7 out of every 8 books it published. So that was in 1936. So has the industry gotten any better at managing that uncertainty? In short, no. It has gotten worse. So I've got some statistics here, and we don't need to belabor these, but now between 2 and 3 million new books get published worldwide every year. That does not include reprints and translations. The average traditionally published book in the US sells about 500 copies in its first year, and then it steeply declines after that, generally. The average self-published book sells between 75 and 250 copies over its lifetime. That statistic we'll take with a grain of salt, because self-publishing has not been around very long, so the lifetime sample size is not very high, and you see a lot of numbers. But anyway, self-published books certainly on average are not outperforming traditionally published books. There's a lot of factors that go into that, so many caveats. So 2004, it's hard to get statistics on publishing and sales in particular. There's a lot of reasons that publishing companies don't want the world at large to know what those numbers typically are. And a lot of reasons that authors don't necessarily want to share their publishing numbers. But so I got some numbers for 2004. So out of 1.2 million traditionally published books, tracked by Nielsen Bookscan, which doesn't cover the entire market, but it's a pretty good representative source of data. Only 2% of that 1.2 million sold more than 5,000 copies. Less than 0.5% sold more than 100,000, and only 10 books sold more than 1 million. But the reality is, even the experts can't predict what books will sell. And that's across genres, across publishing houses. People develop an intuition, and they get better at it over time, but they don't know. They just don't know. So there's been a couple of responses. We'll go through the industry response and the author response to this reality. So the industry response has been very much to adopt a portfolio strategy. So the more books they publish, the greater the odds that one of them is going to be that hit that pays for all of the others. And they're going to get a little bit of residuals on every single title that they publish. So in the aggregate, the publishing house will make money. Then the other strategy that they're trying to do is they're going to offload the risk as much as possible. And if you're an author that's looking to get published, the question that you need to be asking is who is assuming that risk that they're trying to offload? And you see lots of things get put into publishing contracts that try and push that back onto other entities, other people. So I have a book coming out next year that is traditionally published. We went kind of the fully traditional route. We have an agent, a New York-based agent. The agent shopped us around to a bunch of publishing houses. We had some interviews. We talked to one publishing house in particular. We got pretty far with them. I won't say who it was, but it was one of the larger names in the industry. They've been in business for over 100 years. And they said, well, it's, we kind of went back and forth a bit, and they said, well, it's not quite a done deal with us. Would you agree to pre-purchase 5,000 copies of the book? And that wasn't an entirely unreasonable request, because this is a business book, and it was sort of being done within the corporate world. So potentially, the company who was interested in publishing the book could have done that, but that company is not in the business of selling and marketing books, right? So we said, no, we're not going to buy 5. They're going to sit, we're going to warehouse that and figure out, no, we don't do that. We're not in that business. So then we, went on and worked with a different publisher. But yeah, and that's just one example, right? There's lots of examples of ways that publishers try to take their risk and saying, this might be a flop, we don't know, and statistically, it's probably not going to sell very much. So how do we lose as little money to find out, right? On the author side, the response, this is something that I feel like most new authors kind of find their way into. When I was growing up and people said, what do you want to do when you want to grow up? And I would say, I would really want to be an author. What I would hear was, oh, it's so hard to get published, which is true. Or particularly then it was true. It's less true now. What I wish they had known to tell me was, it's so hard to get published, and if you do get published, it is extremely unlikely that you will be able to do that for a living. There's a handful of authors that do it. Very few people can do it. But it's in most authors' best interest to try and appear as successful as possible, right? So authors generally don't talk about the advances that they're getting. They don't talk about how many copies sell. I did a Q&A with a classroom a number of years ago for, I have a young adult fantasy series, which is for sale outside at the book table in case that's your jam. And a friend of mine was teaching high school English and taught one of my books in her classroom and got her district to buy a set of books for the class. And the way that she sold them on it was to say, well, hey, I know the author and he'll come and do a Q&A with the students if we do this, which was great. It was really fun. She kind of prepped me beforehand and she said, all right, now I've told them that they're not allowed to ask you any questions about money, because they're convinced that because you're a published author, you're like this millionaire and you probably live, out in a mansion and, in the forest on vast estates or something. Nothing could be further from the truth. But anyway, authoring books is one of those professions that there's this term hidden money. There's a lot of hidden money in the authoring profession, and all that means is the money that sustains not just your work, but also pays the bills and all that kind of stuff, is not coming from your books. It's coming from your day job. Or it's coming from your spouse's day job. Or someone else in your life is supporting you in some way, right? Hidden money. It's, the adjunct world is very similar to this, right? They talk about hidden money and adjuncting. Because often adjuncting does not pay enough, but people really love their work and they keep doing it, and there's some other way that they're making ends meet. So, and then the other response from authors is that authors increasingly have to become self-marketers. So it used to be that you could get a traditional publishing deal and you could expect that the publishing house would put would devote a budget to marketing that book and trying to sell it. And that's just not necessarily the case anymore. This is another place where publishing houses try and offload that risk. So they want to know, if you've ever looked into publishing, they're going to ask you questions about platform, which is, everybody's favorite word. And you're like, oh gosh, I got to now learn how to be a professional social media user. Because they want to know, are you going to be able to sell this book? Because they don't know that they can, and they don't necessarily have resources that are going to go into it. So authors increasingly have to rely on the publishing house to get their book into print and then sell the book themselves. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but we just need to go into that wide-eyed, right? If not becoming a marketer is really important to you, then you need to make sure that your publishing contract includes a clause where they explicitly lay out, we will market this book, these are the activities we're going to do, this is what if you're lucky, this is what our budget will be. All of those details should be in your contract. Most authors, especially first-time authors looking at a publishing contract, will not realize that that is missing because they take it for granted that this is what's going on. But it's just not the case anymore. So this is the first factor, unpredictable readers. We have no idea how many copies of a book will sell. We really don't. And statistically, it probably won't be very many copies. The other big factor is the cost to produce one new book. By which I mean, just like if you were to publish a book and all you were going to print was one copy, that is the lion's share of cost, right? If you're printing 20 copies, 300 copies, a couple thousand copies, that's just an iterative cost added on that. It's usually pennies on the dollar to print a copy 2 through whatever, right? So it used to be that there was, when you were publishing, you had to come up with a physical template to print the book, and that was very labor intensive. So, I always go back to like the Gutenberg printing press, and I think about people like arranging typesetting, with the little one stamp per letter, and they have to do this for every page, right? There's been a bit of technological advance between those days and where we are now, but the point being, it used to be this very, it used to be a physical template, it used to be a very manual process, and it was very expensive. And to justify that expense, there was almost always a minimum print run, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 copies. If you did what in the 90s they would call this vanity press, where you would go out into a printing house and they would print a book for you. They say, oh, we'll publish your book, and what they mean is we'll print your book and send you 3,000 copies of the book in crates to your garage. Again, it's like prepaying or pre-buying, a few thousand copies of the book. You're paying for that up front, and then it's your job to sell it, right? That used to be how it is. So now templates are digital. They're very easy to create. You can do it in Microsoft Word. Anyone can learn how to do it. It does not take very long to do, and you can get pretty good at it with a little bit of practice. And what that has led to is a model of publishing called print on demand, which means that, and this is true for a lot of books that you see, for example, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble being sold. The book is listed, but there may not actually be a physical copy of that book in existence yet. And as soon as someone orders it, an order goes to a printer who prints one copy of that book and ships it out to you. And that can be done in a matter of a few days. So that is most books. So I helped author a textbook a couple of years ago, and our contract, they actually did a kind of a hybrid thing with the contract, which was interesting. So, well, to me it was interesting. It was interesting to you. They did an initial print run, and then they went to a print-on-demand model. So they said, okay, we've done some market research, and we think we're going to sell, I think it was 2,000 copies was the initial print run, and then it'll be this print on demand. So even and that was a traditional publisher. So even traditional publishing houses are often using this print on demand model. In self-publishing and a lot of independent presses, smaller publishing houses, almost everybody's using print on demand. Okay. So we're going to turn the page. And on the app, the PDF of this handout is called A Publishing You Catastrophe. I bring it up for two reasons. One is there's a further reading section at the bottom of this handout with a bunch of links. Those links are live on the PDF. So that's a lot easier to, than try and laboriously type that out from this page onto your computer screen later if you want to read those. But those kind of those give you kind of the state of publishing, the state of sales, and a lot of what I just talked about. They will help you kind of work through what is it actually like to publish a book, if you want to look into that in more detail. But the reason that I call it a publishing eucatastrophe, Tolkien coined the phrase eucatastrophe in his essay on fairy stories, and that's the fairy tale ending, the joyful overturn. So where things that seem to be going bad are suddenly turned into joy. So that's what we're going to try and get to in the next few minutes. So the reason that I wanted to start the talk in this space is I want all of us to have our expectations set. All of us as writers, all of us as would-be authors, to have our expectations set of what it actually means to publish a book and get out there. As I said, when I was growing up, this information was not readily available. People didn't know. So I thought, it'll be really hard to break into publishing, but I'm going to persist, and eventually I'm going to do it. And I'll get a publishing deal, and maybe that won't bring in very much money, but then I'll follow it up with another one, and eventually I'll be able to quit my day job, and I'll be able to do this full time. And oh Lord, won't that be a wonderful ministry that I'll be able to do? I'll be able to devote myself to thinking and arranging words on a page and communicating your truth in the best possible way and convincingly, and tell these wonderful stories that point to you, and that's really not the world that we live in, right? There's as I said, very few books that get to that point, very few authors that get to that point. And that doesn't mean that the stuff that we're working on isn't worth working on. And here's where I want to turn the corner. So the fairy tale ending, turning the collapse of the mass market into good news. And these are steps. So there's 5 steps to this. The first step is don't play Gold Rush. And I was thinking about this a few years ago when self-publishing started becoming this big thing, because everyone was talking about, there were a few examples early on of folks who were like making 6 figures a month, on Kindle-only publishing, right? Amanda Hawking and the fellow who wrote Wool, I can't remember his name right now. But anyway, early on in self-publishing, there were these few examples, and this happens in every creative industry, right? There's, there's like a Drake, or there's someone who is at the pinnacle of a creative industry that everyone aspires to and says, look, that person, Ed Sheeran, makes a ridiculous amount of money on like downloads all the time, right? Just passively. And so when you're getting into a creative industry, you kind of have this idea that like, oh, that could be me. I could be one of those people. If they can make oodles of money, I don't need oodles of money, just enough to pay my bills and have a nice house and maybe a modest garden, and, really to do my ministry, Lord. But the vast majority of people in every creative industry are not making that kind of money. But there are a lot of people who are making money on our hopes and dreams. So they know that this is what we want, right? This is if you are anything like me as a writer, this is a passionate desire of your heart to write all the time. I would love to just write books all the time. And there's a lot of people who are selling services, self-publishing services, cover art services, book trailers, editing services, marketing packages, everything. And these people are freelancers, right? I'm a freelancer. This is good work. I'm not saying anything against these people. What I am saying is, if someone is couching their pitch to you for their services in this idea that if you will just use me, your book is going to go out there and it's going to sell 1 million copies and you'll be able to buy that Mercedes or whatever it is that is on your heart and you can retire, right? That is the gold rush. So the California gold rush, I think, is a great example of this kind of thing at work. Does anyone know who made money during the California gold rush?
All the infrastructure people. It wasn't the gold mine, it was the infrastructure. It was the people who sold breakfast.
Yeah.
And picks and axes.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of money.
Yeah, in fact, there's, by some accounts, the gold rush was actually started by a guy who heard about the first strike, went around to all the shops in town buying up shovels and pans and all this stuff, right? Poured it all. Then he went around the street shouting, "There's gold in them thar hills," right? And he kind of created the gold rush and said, "By the way, you can get all your material, from me," right? Anybody know any the names of anyone who made it rich painting for gold in the any wealthy families or dynasties? Anyone wear Levi's? Levi Strauss got his start selling coveralls to the prospectors, and most of us have Levi's in our closet now, right? So, yeah. So publishing can get pitched to us like it's the gold rush. There's a lode in the hills, and if you just keep at it long enough, you're gonna find that mother lode, and you're gonna have enough to retire on. But just be savvy about who is telling you that and what their interest is. Because if that were really true, why aren't they out there themselves? In a lot of cases, it's because you have very honest people who are doing great work as freelancers, and they're not interested in writing a book, but they're really interested in helping you get your book out there, right? Again, I'm not saying that the world of freelancing is this, full of awful people who are trying to take advantage of you, but there are those things out there. Even, I used to get the Kindle newsletter. And the Kindle newsletter would always present this, not in so many words, but it would always feature someone who's like, "This is a bestseller, this person self-published a bestseller with us this month, and here's their story, and here's how they did it." And a lot of those stories aren't duplicatable. They published a book into a moment, and the market picked it up, and something happened, right? Again, the market is unpredictable. And if the experts can't predict it, we're not going to be able to predict it. So, in response to that, clarify your calling. Point number 2, to whom are you writing? So I read this on Seth Godin's blog. He's a professional marketer. He's written a number of best-selling books. He wrote this. He said, "If you write a book and it sells 1 million copies, it will be one of the best-selling books of the year. But it will also reach far fewer than 1% of this country's population, never mind the world. Very few products ever rise to 1% of the market. You don't need everyone. In fact, the act of chasing everyone is probably keeping you from reaching anyone." So if we set our scope too wide, and if we're too worried about trying to have this mass market appeal to sell all of these copies, we probably won't write a book that appeals to anyone, or appeals to even fewer people than it might. Edith Wharton, in her book The Writing of Fiction, has a great point about this. She says, "The young novelist will never do his best until he ceases altogether to think of his readers, and also to think of his editor and his publisher, begins to write not for himself, but for that other self with whom the creative artist is always in mysterious correspondence, and who happily has an objective existence somewhere, and will someday receive the message sent to him, though the sender may never know it." So the point being, the reader that your work will serve is out there, and that person is worth serving with your work, even if it's only one person. One of the things that I do is review every single book that I read on Goodreads.com. There's also a website called Library Thing. These are essentially social media platforms for book lovers, and I love books. And so I write short reviews, and I'm connected with a few hundred people all around the world who like books for the same reasons that I like books, and because they've found my reviews, and we start interacting. And I end up in correspondence with these people about all kinds of topics, right? If we're discussing great literature, it has all of these themes in it, right? The transcendentals are present, theology is present, world trends are present, and I end up having these conversations that are kind of disciple-like, right? And but I didn't write that book review with the intent of reaching someone. I just wrote it because this is what I think of this book, and this is how you can decide if you think you'll want to read it too. I've had a handful of people read my fiction and reach out to me. They track me down. I write under a pen name, so it's not easy to do. And I've had a couple of people who are determined enough that they've kind of hunted me out on the internet and said, I think this is you, and I think you wrote this book, and I just wanted to say, something. And usually it's with a question. They have some kind of a question. What is going on here? And then we end up having a deeper conversation. And it's not many people. My books don't sell very many copies, right? I've sold a few hundred copies of every book I've written. But these conversations that I have with my readers are deeply fulfilling to me because something in that book that I have written connects with them very deeply. So that is where I think we will find our real joy in writing, is writing for that other self that Edith Wharton says we're in mysterious correspondence. So with that in mind, take the dare. I love this story. I found this out from reading Diana Glyer. She wrote The Company They Keep and Bandersnatch. I think both of them are probably, again, for sale on Booktable. And I didn't know this, but so in December 1936, C.S. Lewis approached J.R.R. Tolkien with a friendly dare. And at the time, they'd been writing all their lives, but they were largely unknown and they were not published. And Lewis said to Tolkien, Tollers, there is too little of what we really like in books. I'm afraid we're going to have to write some ourselves. And the result of that bet, they worked through some details and they both embarked on this journey. The result of that bet was Out of the Silent Planet. So this starts Lewis's fiction career. And Tolkien starts working on, he never quite finishes his project, but it becomes the downfall of Numenor, which is, if you're a Tolkien enthusiast, this is a big part of the Silmarillion, right? So this is where he gets started working on the background mythology of Middle-earth, without which we would not have The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. So take the dare, right? There are so many, between 2 and 3 million books get published every year. There is this place for the book that interests you deeply. So don't read that statistic and think, oh my gosh, the market is saturated. No one needs this thing that I have to write. Someone needs the thing that you have to write. And the reason that you can know that that person needs that thing that you have to write is because you want to write it. Because you would want to read it, right? You want that book to exist. And because you want that book to exist, you can be confident that someone else does too. And years later, after publishing Narnia and everything Lewis is a very successful writer. He gives a lecture on 3 ways of writing for children. And one of the things that he points to is this idea. And he said, what doesn't concern us deeply, us authors, will not deeply interest our readers. So you have to have that really deep interest in that thing. So what is that thing that there's not enough of what you really like in books? Write that. Okay, number 4. Get creative about means and flexible about results. So this again, Holly did an amazing job talking about this in the previous session, which I think most of you were here for, and if you weren't, you can probably watch it later. Write regularly, but don't put these rules on yourself that I have to write every day or I have to write first thing in the morning. And write on a schedule that is flexible to your life, right? It has to work with your life. So as you're in different seasons of life. Your job has a different schedule. Your school has a different schedule. Your families have a different schedule. That is going to change. And all of those will impact your writing schedule. But keep with writing regularly. And look at many different ways of getting your work out there. So a lot of times you'll have an idea and you'll think this is going to be a novel, but maybe it's not going to be a novel. Maybe it's going to be a set of poems, or maybe it's going to be a screenplay. Maybe it's going to be a script for a graphic novel. Maybe this is going to be a collection of essays. Maybe it's not going to be a collection of essays. Maybe it's going to be a unified nonfiction book. Maybe it's going to be a series of lectures, right? Maybe it's going to be all of those things. Once you have that thing, that passion project that you're working on, something that interests you deeply, something there's not enough of out there, take that work and try it out in many different forms. Because I think you're going to find that every time you try it in a different form, you're going to find a new way of communicating it, and you're going to reach a new person with it. Someone who connects with a talk better than they connect with a book, or someone who connects with an audiobook better than they connect with an essay. So don't be too rigid either in how you write or in what the product will look like, what the package of the message or of the story will be. So be creative about that. And then be flexible about the results. So again, don't expect an amount of money commensurate with the amount of effort that you put in. The amount of time, attention, blood, sweat, tears, agony, at times that goes into writing a book, a book can be 10 years in the making or longer. It can involve travel and research and lots of expenses. You're probably not going to make that back as money. But what you want to do is get the time and attention from your reader and think of that as your reward. So you the biggest input that you put into writing is your time and attention. And if you can get a reader to put anything close to the time and attention that you put into that project, man, you have connected. That person is passionate about what you had to say or what the story that you had to tell. So think about that as your reward, the time and attention of the reader, rather than the financial compensation. There's the famous line, "Don't quit your day job," right? I think that phrase gets a bad rap, right? People hear you singing in the shower and they say, "Don't quit your day job," and as your art's probably not good enough to support you professionally. But realistically, almost no one's art is good enough to support them professionally. That's the point, So that's not the idea here, right? Don't quit your day job, because that is financing your passion. So find a way for your income, your means of staying afloat, paying the bills, reaching your other goals. Find a way for that to fund this really important work that you're doing as a writer. And finally, don't go alone. Every time I give a talk, I plug this. I'm not going to read the quote. This is again from Diana Glyer. But the point is, you need others. You need to be writing in community. And again, not the focus of today, and there's lots of resources available about that. So we won't focus on finding a writers group, except I will make this one point about finding a writers group. Try and find a writers group where the people in that group have, I won't say that they're as serious, because I think that's not quite the right phrase. Make sure that they have similar publishing goals for their work. So I have been part of writing groups where people really want to write, but they don't necessarily want to want to put it out there in the world. They kind of want to keep it as a personal project, and that's perfectly fine. But if your goal is publishing, you should be around other writers who also want to publish, because that is it's a different technique. You have to do different things with your writing. You have to surrender control and create a vision a little bit, right? As soon as you start working with anyone else, right, and a freelance editor, even a copy editor, even a proofreader, right, someone's going to say, the sentence structure doesn't work, and you're like, oh, but I did that on purpose. I really want passive voice right there. I really want active voice right there. And they're saying it'll be stronger if you flip your words around, right? And there's a certain kind of writer that doesn't want that interference, and that's okay. But if you want to be out in the world presenting your work for an audience, then be with other writers who also want that, because that's really important. It affects kind of all of the feedback that you give each other. So I'm gonna stop there and open it up for questions. And if there are any questions on the app,
None so far.
None so far.
Repeat the questions as they're asked.
I will do that. Yes, sir.
So I'm kind of hearing similar things in the music industry, and as an adjunct teacher, you mentioned that from last year.
Yeah.
Pretty exploitative.
Yes.
And I'm not doing that as a passion, never wanted to be a teacher, but that's the only job I've got.
Okay.
What's left of it. So when you say that, like, there's no, in America, I don't know about Europe, I can only speak about the United States. You think there's no middle class for, like, artistic expression in the United States? You either make it or you don't. And, like, in the middle, there's no value added. Not value added, but they're not valued. Do you think that's true or not?
That's a really good question. So the question is there a sort of middle class in the creative professions? Is there anyone who's sort of making it, but maybe not necessarily making six figures, or whatever else you want to think of as like monetarily successful? But is there kind of this middle ground where you're? And yes, there are people who are kind of at a when I say subsistence level, that also sounds a little bit. Basically, I would say the people who are sort of comfortably in the arts as creatives, probably in every form of arts, even poetry, which is notoriously not a great commercial enterprise. But it's not many people. So statistically, yeah, it's. If you go into, let's say, an airport bookstore, which is probably going to be your top 1% of commercially successful authors, there's probably, I don't know, half of them who are not, fabulously wealthy, but also are writing full-time as their profession. So it's there, but again, it's not very many people relative to the total number of authors and books out there. Yeah.
Tagging on that question, in my experience, and I know more musicians than writers, those who are maybe in that middle section, they're diversified. So like they're writing
Yes.
and speaking or doing a little bit of teaching. Or they're a worship pastor who often their church gives them enough freedom to also do a little bit of recording and writing.
Yeah.
Would that be your experience of people who were able to eke it out in that middle artistic space? Is that I'm willing to diversify and sort of patch together?
So I'm actually thinking of that more. Okay, so I'll just repeat the question quickly. So the question is people who kind of have tangential work, either a speaking circuit or a teaching job, or like as you said, a pastor, worship pastor maybe who gets to do recording on the side and has these other sources of income that are creative and they're related to their creative work, but they aren't the work directly. That I think falls more into what I was talking about with the hidden money category, because a lot of writers, so nonfiction writers especially, make most of their money on the lecture circuit. And fiction writers often, will find a teaching job or they have, a day job. But no, that isn't what I was thinking of in terms of kind of that middle class. I was thinking about people who really are just purely doing their own creative work. And there are, I mean, those people exist, right? Any one of you might be one of them for all I know, right? And, or you might become one of them in the very near future. It can happen, right? So my point is not that, that these things don't happen, but that they may not happen, and we shouldn't plan for them to happen because we can't guarantee it. Yeah.
Okay, we have an online question. Is how do you find a professional cover designer or book designer?
How do you find a professional cover designer or book designer? There are a lot of ways. And there are, I mean, you can Google it, for one. I suspect that the question is more about how would you vet someone who's worth engaging. And there's a couple of things that I would say about that. Because there are people who, you know, if you Google it, you're going to find pages and pages of results of people who are offering to do that for you. A lot of self-publishing platforms and independent publishers will have those people in-house, and a lot of them will say, hey, you can, you know, bring your own art to the table, or for an additional fee, we can create it for you. And that's not a bad way to go necessarily. The most important thing is to understand the work that you'll be getting. So you need to look at, you need to see a portfolio of that artist's work and know that it's in the style that you want for your book, or the look that you want for your book. Ideally, you're going to see testimonials, or you're going to have access to references from that artist or that cover designer, so that you know that they've done this before and they've had other people who've been happy with the results, not just the artistic outcome, but the process of working with that person. And part of that, and I would say the last thing, is they need to have a contract. So you need to not work with someone who's like, hey, I'll do it for you, and just transfer $50 into my PayPal account and I'll have it ready for you at the end of the month or whatever, right? Or $500 or $5,000. I was once quoted $5,000 for just the image. And I wish I could have afforded that artist because her work was amazing. But yeah, you can pay a lot or a little bit of money for artwork and graphic design, and that's not even necessarily reflective of the quality that you're going to get, right? Some people just it's not that's not their day job either, right? So some people are like, yeah, this is just fun. This is a good outlet for me. I'm happy to do this for $50, and it's amazing work. And other people are like, this is my living, and I need $5,000, or I'm going to move on to someone who's more serious, right? So, yeah.
Just to add on to what you said, I was following somebody on Instagram probably at least a year, saw a lot of his work and really liked it. He was never advertising his services, he just puts art out there.
Yeah.
So I DM'd him and I said, hey man, what would you charge to do a book cover? Are you interested? And so I ended up just PayPaling him some money, and it worked out, thankfully.
Yeah.
But to your point about reviewing the portfolio, I think Instagram is a great way to get a look at how consistent people are, what their style is, what they can do for you.
Yeah, I think I've had some of my favorite kind of artist discoveries that way, where I've looked at someone's Instagram, or deviantart.com is a social media site for artists and art lovers, art appreciators. I found people that way. And yeah, I've had great experiences doing that very thing, where you see someone whose art that you like and they're not advertising services, or but then you say, hey, I'd like to make a commission. Would you consider this, and what would you charge? And yeah, those can be fantastic ways.
Have you worked with agents? Do you have anything you want to talk about, finding agents, working with agents?
Finding and working with agents, yes.
I'm nowhere near that, but just to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have an agent right now for this nonfiction project that I was talking about earlier, the business book. He is fantastic. I think a good agent is more than worth their commission. And actually, let me address that quickly. A good agent does not charge you up front. A good agent takes 15% of your royalty on the back end. So they don't get paid until they find you a publisher. And if they don't find you a publisher, you get a different agent who does find you a publisher. I think they're highly, highly, highly worthwhile. So for this book in particular, I put together what I thought was a pretty good nonfiction book proposal, but I don't have a lot of experience in nonfiction book proposals. I shopped it around to a bunch of agents, and we signed with an agent about 3 months into that process, and And about 3 months after that, I was still getting rejection letters from other agents who had reviewed that proposal. And then that agent said, look, I see what you guys are going for in this proposal that you've put together, but it's not up to my standards. I'm not going to take this and give it to editors. Let me send you a couple of copies of successful book proposals for books that I have sold in the last couple of months. You know, these are books that don't exist yet. Let me show you these, and I want you to rework your proposal along these lines, and then we'll take it to editors. And that was immensely valuable. And I mean, I think if I'd gone directly to editors, which, you know, there are some publishing houses that will let you, again, this is depending on the genre, depending on the publishing house, there are some that will let you query them directly without an agent, and there are some that won't. So for some book projects, you have to have an agent or you're just never going to get traditionally published. Others are more flexible. In business books, it's sort of, you know, both and, right? I think if I had gone directly to editors with that initial proposal without the benefit of that agent's experience, I don't think we would have gotten anywhere. So I'm, you know, thumbs up for agents, definitely worth doing. Landing an agent is very much about the traditional query letter, that 1 to 1.5 page document that has who you are, what your book project is, why you're the person to write it, why the market needs that book, and how quickly you can deliver it, again, in 1.5 pages. And by the way, you better get their attention in the first line or it's going directly in the slush pile, right? It is very, very, very competitive. The other thing I will say about agents, you want an agent that is a member of, there's a professional agents guild. I would not go with anyone who isn't a member, and they will put that front and center, because what that means is that they don't engage in predatory practices, and there are agents that do. So, yeah, that's a great question. Anyone else?
So do you recommend a different agent if you're going to, for nonfiction and fiction, if you were going to do both? How does that work?
That's a good question. Would you go with a different agent for fiction and nonfiction? I would say it depends on the agent. So the agent that I'm working with right now only handles nonfiction, and he specializes in business books. I don't only write that, right? I write, you know, young adult fantasy. I write poetry. Last year my book project was a textbook on medical device cybersecurity that I don't know anything about well, I didn't know anything about medical device. Now I know more than I wanted to know about it. You know, but I helped a couple of experts put their thoughts together and organize them into a book form. So yeah, so my particular agent has a very specific focus. Some agents will actually, most agents specialize in just a couple of genres because those are the specific editors that they work with, and they know what kind of books are going to work in that field. Again, with the idea that readers are unpredictable, the market is unpredictable, agents who specialize and who have, you know, some history, 10, 20 years in publishing, have a much better handle on what is going to be successful, the more that they specialize and the more that they're focused on their genre. So I would say it's probably better to go with different agents depending on if you're working in different genres, because you do want, you know, you are paying for their service, in royalties at the back end, and they're going to get the most value out of that if they're narrowly focused in selling that particular kind of book.
If you go back to the self-marketing, I've attended several workshops and they've talked a lot about that. If you don't want to be a self-marketer, you don't have a huge platform, you're not a social queen or king of media, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, what are your options? Because, you know, I know certain people have gone through self-publicizing, not publicizing, but publication, and hoping that it'll get picked up by a publisher.
Mm.
I mean, this is a pretty fierce world from what I've heard in other workshops I've attended. I mean, since you're trying to give us a little hope here, I mean, how would you steer and guide it on that, regarding that part?
Yeah. So the question is, if you're, yeah, I guess if you don't have a big platform, right? You've written a book, but you're not already, you know, queen of blogs, and you don't have a big social media following or whatever. What are your options? And the answer is, particularly if you're self-publishing, you can start marketing anytime, and you can continue marketing forever. So you don't have to, particularly if you're self-publishing, you don't have to begin. Seth Godin, who I mentioned earlier, says the best time to start marketing a book is 3 years before it's published. That's true, but there's a whole other aspect to it, which is that you can put a book out there and then start selling it, and you can and should only market and engage, particularly on social media. You should only engage in those things that interest you. So Facebook, for me, I don't really enjoy doing anything on Facebook. I'm very seldom on, and I haven't found, you know, even among my friends, right? I have best friends who've never read any of my books. Shame on them. No, not at all. That's fine. Like, that's not, you know, they don't need to like prove their loyalty. They've known me since I was knee-high to me. But it hasn't, you know, that hasn't been a good platform for me, and it's not one that I enjoy engaging on. I really enjoy engaging on Goodreads about other people's books. So I keep, you know, reading books and writing reviews and then engaging with other readers on Goodreads. That's been a phenomenal market for me, because then people go, oh, this is interesting. I really like, you know, your review of The Wind in the Willows. I really like what you had to say about Watership Down, or, you know, whatever it is, right? And I'm just interacting on that book, and they go, oh, and I see you've written something. Maybe I'll give it a try. So that works very well. And yeah, so you don't have to start with a massive market. Yes, right. Okay, let me finish with this one, because I'm not. So you don't have to start with one. The other option that I would say is you can still find publishing companies that are willing to put together a marketing package for you. A lot of, especially independent publishing companies, will do that at additional expense, at which point it's kind of like it's back to the vanity press model. So just understand what you're buying and whether or not it's worth it to you, because marketing is a lot of work and time. So maybe that's worth it, right? Maybe it's worth it to buy a marketing package. You can also find publishing houses that will put their own money into marketing your book. It's not as common, but if you're determined that that is what you want to do, because what you want to do is get your manuscript into the hands of someone who's going to, you know, treat it right and get it out into the world, and you want to just get back to writing the next book or whatever your next project is, right? You can still find those publishing companies, and you can still find those publishing deals within, you know, you can draw a hard line and say, look, if you guys aren't willing to put a marketing budget and a marketing plan behind this project, I'm just going to take it elsewhere, right? There's an extent to which the people who are writing these contracts are counting on our desperation to be in print, right? To make us sign on, you know, on the dotted line, as it were. And you just have to have resistance to that. So what's our online question?
Okay, this will probably have to be our last question.
Okay.
If you have a book with a Christian message and are specifically are there specifically Christian agents, and how do you find them?
Yes and yes. There are specifically Christian agents. So the go-to advice that I would normally give for how to find really any agent is there's a publication from Writer's Digest called Writer's Market. The 2020 edition might be the last print edition of that book ever. It used to be that if you were a member of Writer's Digest Online, you could subscribe to Writer's Market. And it was a listing of publishing houses and agents, pretty much comprehensive. And you could find out what genres they were working in, what kind of books they were interested in, all their contact information, website, all that good stuff. That would have been my go-to. Last time I tried to look at their online space, I found a parking page so I'm actually not sure if that site is currently active, and if it is not currently active, I don't know when it will be brought back online. That was and maybe still is, the premier database for that source of information. There's a few other ways to do it. Twitter is a big one, surprisingly. A lot of agents and acquisition editors are active on Twitter, and they are constantly tweeting about what projects that they're looking for, so you can start following people that way. There's a few other web searches and things like that. It becomes a much more manual process without, again, that kind of centralized database. Yeah. So yes, again, there are specifically Christian agents, and you can find them for Christian publishing. If you're talking about fiction versus nonfiction, I think in Christian publishing, if you're writing nonfiction, there's typically not agents involved. Like if you're writing theology and things like that, I think most people are not using agents, but some are. So yeah, it parallels the I guess the secular publishing world, if you want to use that term pretty strongly. Yeah.
What about universities and their press things that they do?
Yeah.
How,
Just what about them?
well, how would you approach a university press with your manuscript?
Yeah. So how do you approach a university press with your manuscript? Very similarly to.
A query letter.
Yeah. Yep. And most, if you go to the website, and I highly recommend that you do this before you ever send a query letter, is go to the website of that agent or that publishing house and there's almost always a section on that that's called guidelines or writer's guidelines. And they will tell you very specifically, this is how we want to be approached, and this is what we want to see in that first contact. And man, follow those instructions to the letter. Don't deviate, because they're looking for, publishing houses get so many queries, they're looking for any excuse to toss your letter without following up. Just simply to narrow it down and get through their pile of mail. Yeah, so yeah, and the university press is really no different. So we're just about at 5. I am here all weekend. I love to talk more. This is, my passion project, not my day job. So happy to talk with anybody as much as you are able to steal time away from everything else. But thank you very much for being here. I have been Jason Smith. I think I forgot to introduce myself earlier at the beginning. But yeah, thank you all for coming.